So Ed, you're our lead pastor here in Grosvenor, and you and the other leaders in the church have decided that it would be best for us not to gather in the coming weeks as a result of this virus. Now, the Bible teaches us clearly that we shouldn't neglect gathering together. And so is this the right decision that has been made?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. And lovely to see you at home. Normal circumstances, I think gathering is really important to help us to live for Jesus, and normally not an optional extra. But I suppose these are not normal circumstances, and we've taken this decision as a leadership for a few different reasons. The Bible tells us that we should submit to the governing authorities unless they're asking us to do something that is evil, and their advice is to restrict gathering as much as possible. So we are submitting to that. Jesus tells us to love our neighbours, and in part we can do that by not helping the spread of this disease. And the Bible also is all about protecting life, and so if that means making sacrifices to increase the chance of saving lives, then that is something that we must do. And yet, I suppose we still want to recognise that we need each other to keep going as Christians, and that's partially why we're doing this live broadcast today, to help people keep fixing their eyes on Jesus, and why we're encouraging one another to be in contact with each other over the next few weeks to help us to do that as well.
Yeah, really helpful. The Bible teaches us clearly that God is in control, and at the same time that God is good. So how do we make sense of the coronavirus? How would God allow something like this to happen?
Yeah. I mean, that's a huge question, isn't it? And in a sense, there's not enough time to go into it in great detail, and in a sense there's no easy answers. Actually, in 2 weeks' time, the passage we'll be looking at in Romans is really helpful on this, and we will have a chance then in more detail to consider why does God allow this kind of suffering in our world. But maybe two quick things to say now. The link between sin and suffering. So when men and women first rejected God, and that rejection is still continuing on today, it's what the Bible calls sin. That is so serious, it was so serious that it put the whole world out of joint. And that is what caused sin and suffering and death to come into our world. So the link between sin and suffering, but you might want to ask, well, why doesn't God do something about that? And I suppose the second thing to say is God's response to that suffering. Actually, God really does care. And in fact, he loves us so much, he sent his only son, Jesus, to come amongst us. And when Jesus came, he experienced what it was like to live in this world. He knows what it's like to live in a world of death and suffering. But more than that, Jesus himself suffered. He died for our sin, and dealt with our sin so that we could be forgiven for our rejection of God, so I could be forgiven for mine. And then he rose again so that we could know that if we rely on Jesus, we too will be raised to life and be able to share in his new world, which is going to be a world with no more sin or suffering or death.
Great. Well, it's good to be reminded of God's character in the midst of such days. In these difficult days, how can we respond as a church family, as Christians, to each other and to those around us?
Yeah, I think the simple answer is let's keep looking to Jesus. So if we are wondering, does God care? Is he for us? Well, look at Jesus. Jesus loved me. He died for me. If I feel afraid, well, look at Jesus. He is with me. If I'm wondering what I should do, well, listen to Jesus. Follow Jesus's example. Jesus said, don't worry, your Father knows what you need. Instead, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. So maybe two quick comments on how we should respond. I think first, faith and not fear. So we know God is good, he is with us, he is in control. He's even able to use dreadful circumstances like this for his good. And if we're trusting in Jesus, we know that actually we have the hope of life beyond death. So let's trust God in the midst of this. I think the second thing to say is serve God and others and not ourselves. So seek first God's kingdom. And so what does that mean? Well, it means, yes, we do personally need to be wise about following the advice about Covid-19 and making sure that we are protecting ourselves and washing and being careful about what people we come in contact with. But we should also, alongside that, have a concern for others. And that'll mean praying, as we have been doing already, praying for our government, for those who are working in the hospitals and helping people on the medical side, praying for those who are sick, praying for our world in this situation. I think it'll mean making contacts. Maybe that's virtually, maybe for some it's not, just to make sure people are getting the help that they need and aren't feeling isolated, and so offering that help as well. And yet I think in all of this, as we are thinking of serving God and others, praying primarily that God would teach us through this, that we would see what is actually true, that we're not in control as we like to think we are, that we are dependent, that we're not immortal, and that actually all of us need to turn to God for his help.
Great. That's really, really helpful, Ed. Yeah.